Action.
All right. Good evening, everyone. And welcome back. I know we took a week off last week as we were doing a family trip to Chicago. And thank God we went in peace and returned in peace. Good to be back. So we start with L'chaim. Special week, the week of Yud Shvat, which is to celebrate the leadership of the Rebbe. It's the week of Shabbos Shira, Shabbos of Song, and it's my nephew's bar mitzvah. So this is very exciting. We're going to celebrate David's bar mitzvah here, so lots to celebrate. So l'chaim l'bracha. All right, today's Gemara is going to be mostly halachic. So it's going to be it's as we pointed out, the Gemara is made up of many. What makes the Gemara so interesting is that you come across everything in the Gemara. The Gemara is really like the conversations as they took place in the yeshiva hall. So you have the halachic part of the Gemara, the in-depth, diving into in-depth understanding of the theories behind things, and there's also the stories in the Gemara, some very fantastical stories. But this Gemara is going to be more halachic. Some would say is maybe a drier Gemara than some of the ones we've done. This is quite different than the one we did a few weeks ago about people conversing in cemeteries and communicating, the spirits communicating. Those are the more fascinating Gemaras. But these Gemaras, the ones like we're going to get to today, are very practical and provide very important insights in Jewish life, often in daily living. So today's Gemara, again, is going to be a practical section of the Gemara. So we spoke about last week, or 2 weeks ago, I should say, we established a certain principle, which is a very important principle when it comes to Jewish observance, and that is that men and women don't have equal obligation when it comes to the commandments. Okay? We have 613 mitzvahs, 613 commandments. And as we often point out, the translation of mitzvah is not good deed, but commandment. Many mitzvahs are good deeds, but mitzvah means commandment. So there are 613 commandments, 365 negative commandments or prohibitions, and 248 positive commandments. So when it comes to the 365 prohibitions, then men and women are equal in the prohibition. That is, assuming it's not a mitzvah which is specific for a man or a woman. There are such mitzvahs which are very specifically for men or for women. Obviously, a mitzvah like circumcision is a mitzvah for men. A mitzvah, certain mitzvahs which have to do with family purity are connected to women. So there are mitzvahs which are specifically for a specific gender. But generally speaking, any of the neutral 365 prohibitions are equally forbidden to both men and women. So both men and women are forbidden to murder one another, for example. In case anybody thought that it was only for one gender, murder is prohibited to both genders. As is theft, as is jealousy. All the prohibitions of the Torah apply to men and women equally. However, when it comes to the positive commandments, there it is different. And there is a very significant difference between the obligation that men have in positive commandments and the obligation that women have in positive commandments. And the rule is as follows. Any mitzvahs aseh shehazman grama, any positive commandment that is time-bound, is an obligation only to men. For women, it is a mitzvah, but not an obligation. So even though we translated mitzvah as commandment, there are situations in which it could be a voluntary mitzvah. And I think we spoke about this last week. Visiting the sick is a mitzvah. And if I visited the sick today or tonight, I will have fulfilled a mitzvah. But I am not obligated to visit the sick. So it's a mitzvah that I can opt in to, but I'm not obligated to do. So the Talmud tells us all time-bound positive commandments for a man is an obligation, and for a woman is an opt-in mitzvah. If she wants to, she can fulfill the mitzvah, but she's not obligated to do so. Now, certain mitzvahs come to mind immediately. What's a time-bound positive commandment? So you may think, well, shofar, or those which are the holidays once a year. Pesach, we have matzah, and Purim, and the holidays are time-bound commandments. But there are some mitzvahs which are less obvious, but are also time-bound commandments. For example, tzitzis or tefillin, which are anything which is only an obligation by daytime and not by nighttime, is a time-bound positive commandment. So that's what the Gemara is getting into over here. And the last thing we said was that women are obligated in prayer. Now you may ask, and this is somewhat of a repetition of the last thing we learned. You may ask, why should they be obligated in prayer? After all, prayer is a time-bound positive commandment, right? We daven Shachris in the morning. We daven Mincha in the afternoon. We daven Ma'ariv at night. You're not allowed to daven Shachris in the afternoon. You're not allowed to daven Mincha in the morning. So it would seem to be a time-bound positive commandment. And so why is it that women are obligated in prayer? So the answer is like this. This was said last week. That the truth is, the Torah obligation of prayer is not Shachris or Mincha or Ma'ariv. The Torah obligation of prayer is that when one finds themselves in a state of need, they should turn to God. That is the Torah obligation of prayer. The sages, in order to strengthen our prayer commitment, the sages revolutionized prayer. So the whole idea, so much of how we pray is midrabanan, is from the sages, starting with Shachris, Mincha, and Ma'ariv. The fact that we daven 3 times a day, morning, afternoon, and evening, is a rabbinic concept. So it is, the prayer itself may be a Torah obligation, but how we do it, and this is true about so much of Judaism, even those areas which are Torah obligations, the sages provided all sorts of direction in how that Torah obligation should be fulfilled. So prayer is essentially not time-bound. Prayer is whenever one is in a state of need, they should turn to God for salvation, turn to God for help, turn to God for blessing. That's the obligation of prayer. That's not connected to any time. So therefore, prayer becomes a time-bound mitzvah, a positive obligation, which is not time-bound. And when it comes to, I should have said this earlier, commandments which are positive commandments, which are not time-bound, are, again, an equal obligation for men and women. What are examples of commandments which are not time-bound, positive commandments which are not time-bound? Yes? Tzedakah. It is an obligation. That is an example, and that is a good example. Tzedakah is an obligation, and this is another point that it's important to recognize. Judaism does not see tzedakah as something which is voluntary. Tzedakah is an obligation, but tzedakah is not connected to any time. One could argue that tzedakah is not given on Shabbos, right? But the truth is, you can give tzedakah on Shabbos. You can't give money on Shabbos, but you can give food. So tzedakah is a positive commandment which is not time bound. So men and women are equally obligated in tzedakah. Ahavas Hashem, love of God. Ahavas Yisrael, love of one's fellow Jew. These are time-bound commandments, these are positive commandments, not time-bound, so men and women are obligated. So prayer, even though we usually associate prayer with times, perhaps more so than anything else, we associate prayer with times, right? This is the exact time you're allowed to start davening shachar. This is the exact time you're allowed to end davening. This is so when we think of prayer, we think of it in terms of time. But the truth is, prayer is a mitzvah which is not time-bound. So the Gemara knows this all. So the Gemara says, why would there even be a svara? Why would you even consider that women wouldn't be obligated in prayer? After all, prayer is not time-bound. The Gemara says no, because there is a pasuk. There is a pasuk in Tehillim in which King David says, I turn to you in evening, morning, and afternoon. So you may think that prayer is connected to time. Therefore, the Talmud clarifies prayer is not connected to any specific time, and therefore it is a obligation for men and women equally. And aside from the technical message the Gemara is telling us, which is that prayer is an obligation for men and women equally, I think it also is a reminder of what prayer is. Often we get too caught up in the technicalities of davening. I'm not saying that the technicalities are wrong. I'm not saying that the prayer book and the page numbers and the times are wrong. They're right. You should daven at the right time, and you should make sure you say the right prayers, and you should add the right inserts on the right days. But it's important to remember what prayer is. Prayer is that when I'm in a state of need, I turn to God and I ask God for blessing. That is prayer. And it could be that I'm sitting at a red light and I'm on my way to something, and I'm nervous because I may be late, and I turn to God and I say, God, please help me in this situation. Help me to come on time, or help me that this meeting should go well. I have fulfilled the Torah obligation of prayer at that moment. As opposed to someone who could spend an hour in shul and gets there and starts davening at the right time and ends at the right time and says every word in the prayer book, but at no point actually thinks about the fact that they are talking to God and communicating and turning to God and asking for their needs, that person has not fulfilled the obligation of prayer. So again, the point over here is not to diminish the importance of all the ideas and the rules that were established by the sages about prayer, but they weren't trying to take away from the essential idea of prayer. They were trying to add to it in order to assist a person in their communication with God. Let's establish 3 times a day that you can do it. In order to assist a person in their communication with God, let's establish the 18 blessings that you should ask God for. But it always comes back to the essential idea, which is that davening is asking God for your needs, and that is the mitzvah. And that's why it is a mitzvah for both men and women equally, because it is not a time-bound mitzvah. Fine. Let's move on to the next example where the Talmud says there's a positive commandment for men and women equally. The Mishnah says another thing that both men and women are equally obligated in is Birkas Hamazon, the grace after meals. That is a Torah obligation to bench. The blessings that we make before we eat are only rabbinic. The blessings we make after we eat, if it's not a meal, is also only rabbinic. But when you have a meal, when you wash and you have bread and you eat a meal, the blessing you make after that is a Torah obligation. And the Talmud tells us this is an obligation that is equal for both men and women. The Gemara says, isn't that obvious? Benching is not a time-bound command. It's not a time-bound commandment. In other words, why would the Mishnah even have to tell us this? Once we know the principle, we know that benching is equally an obligation for men and women. Why did the Mishnah have to tell us that which is obvious? So the Gemara says, no, maybe it wouldn't be obvious. Why? Mahu detema. You may think because there's a verse, and it's actually a verse in this week's parsha. This week's parsha talks about the manna that fell from heaven. And one of the lines when it comes about when it speaks about the man, chapter 16, verse number 8, the pasuk says, "B'seis Hashem or B'teis Hashem lachem ba'erev basar lechol," when God will give you in the evening meat to eat, v'lechem ba'boiker l'spoya, and bread in the morning to satiate yourself. So you may think because the Torah associates food with morning and evening, and to some degree so do we. Right? When we think of eating, most people at least don't think of eating as something that's constantly done throughout the day. Most people think of eating at set times. There's breakfast, there's lunch, there's supper. In the times of the Talmud, actually, the standard was 2 meals a day, not 3 meals a day. A morning meal and an evening meal. So most people, food is often associated with a specific time. And the Torah itself links it to a specific time because it says, I will give you bread in the morning and meat in the evening. Maybe that's God's way of telling you how you should arrange your meals. You have your right now in the evening, we have meat downstairs if you want. Not right now, but after the class, go down and get yourself a corned beef sandwich. So this idea of that God gives you meat in the evening and bread in the morning. So because the Torah itself associates eating with times, you may think that benching, which is connected to eating, is also associated with time. Kamash Malan. Therefore, the Mishnah says no. Benching is an equal obligation for men and women. Fine. Now the Gemara goes on and shares a very interesting idea. And this is one of the exceptions to the principle we've stated. Again, the principle has been so far that a time-bound positive commandment, men are obligated in and women are not. Women can opt into it, but they're not obligated in it. And here we have one of the very important exceptions of that. And that is Shabbos. Shabbos would seem to be a very obvious time-bound mitzvah. It's once a week, right? So that would seemingly be that would fit into this rule perfectly. That any negative commandment when it comes to Shabbos, any prohibition of Shabbos, the 39 prohibited labors, okay, prohibitions are equal for men and women. But what are some of the positive commandments of Shabbos? Maybe that should only be for men, or not maybe, seemingly, the rule should be only men would be obligated in the positive commandments of Shabbos. What are the positive commandments of Shabbos? Kiddush. That's right, Kiddush and Havdalah. And there's Challah. There's certain things we do on Shabbos. And those mostly when we think of Shabbos, we think of what's the Hebrew word for someone who is Shabbos observant? Shomer Shabbos. But Shomer Shabbos is only half of Shabbos. The word Shomer Shabbos literally means to guard the Shabbos. Guarding the Shabbos is very specifically a reference to the prohibitions of Shabbos. When we say Shamar es Yom HaShabbos, you should guard the Shabbos, means guard it from doing work on Shabbos. So a Jew is not enough to be a Shomer Shabbos. Shomer Shabbos just means that I avoid doing forbidden work on Shabbos. A Jew is obligated to also be a Zocher Shabbos. Remember the Shabbos, which means you remember it by making Kiddush at the beginning of Shabbos, and making a Kiddush again in the middle of Shabbos, and making Havdalah at the end of Shabbos. So the obligation of Shabbos is to be Shomer Shabbos, which is to guard against prohibition, and to be Zocher Shabbos, to commemorate the Shabbos. To some degree, when you go out of shul and you wish someone else good Shabbos, you are, according to some, fulfilling the obligation of Zachar es Yom HaShabbos, to remember the Shabbos. Simply by referring to it as good Shabbos, as a special day, you are honoring and remembering the Shabbos, and perhaps fulfilling the Torah obligation of to remember the Shabbos. But the point, coming back to our Gemara, it would seem that women would be obligated in the prohibitions of Shabbos, but would not be obligated in the obligations of Shabbos, because it's a time-bound positive commandment. Says the Gemara, that's not the case. Amar Rav Ada bar Ava, Rav Ada the son of Ava said, Nashim chayavos b'kiddush hayom. Women are obligated in Kiddush. Women are obligated to either make or hear Kiddush, just as men are obligated to make or hear Kiddush. Devar Torah, according to Torah law. Kiddush hayom over here means of the day, not daytime Kiddush, but Kiddush of the day. And in fact, because you bring that up, the nighttime Kiddush is actually a stronger obligation than the daytime Kiddush. The nighttime Kiddush is a Torah obligation. The daytime Kiddush is a rabbinic obligation. Be that as it may, women are obligated in Kiddush as much as men are, which seems to go against the rule. So the Gemara says, Hamai, why are women obligated? Mitzvah sasesha man gramahu. It is a classic example of a positive commandment that is time-bound. Why would women be obligated? And we have the rule that any positive commandment which is time-bound, women are exempt from. Says the Gemara. Amar Abaye. So Abaye offered one answer. As you can see, it's not the conclusive answer. But Abaye said, Midrabana. They are obligated to make Kiddush Midrabana. It's not a Torah obligation for them. It's a rabbinic obligation. So it's true, as far as the Torah obligation, they don't have it because it's a time-bound positive commandment. But the sages said that women are obligated to hear Kiddush. Amarle Rava. Rava, who was Abaye's contemporary, disagrees with that. He says, V'hadvar Torah kamer. The statement in the Talmud was, women are obligated by virtue of the Torah to hear Kiddush and Shabbos. How can you say it's only from the sages? V'oid, it says furthermore, why would the sages take one positive commandment and make it an obligation for women? What's unique about this? Why not shofar? Why not matzah on Pesach? Why not why not any other positive time bomb? Why suddenly this mitzvah are women obligated to do? Again, shofar or sukkah, those are classic examples in which a woman is not obligated to hear shofar. Again, typically they do, and it's a mitzvah if they do, but that's by choice. Same as with the sukkah and sukkahs, it's by choice. So why would this be any different? So he's asking about, firstly, the wording doesn't seem to be the case. Secondly, why would the sages choose one mitzvah and say this is this we're going to enforce and make this an obligation for men and women equally? Ella Amar Rava, rather, Rava gives the following answer, and this is a very important rule with regards to Shabbos. Amar Kra, the sage, the pasuk said, there's something very interesting, and that is, and this is where you have to use Gemara logic or Torah logic. When God gave the 10 Commandments, we find the 10 Commandments mentioned twice in the Torah. Once in the book of Yisro, which we're going to read in a week and a half, and once in the book of Devarim. Which is the fourth of the 10 Commandments? Anybody know offhand? The fourth of the 10 Commandments. Nope. Honor your mother and father is number 5. Shabbos. Shabbos is the fourth of the 10 Commandments. What is the wording of the commandment? What? Zachar es Yom Shabbos. Remember the day of the Shabbos. Is that the wording? So the answer is yes or no. The word Zachar es Yom in the book of Devarim, in the book of Yisro, which we're going to read in a week, it says, the fourth commandment says, Zachar es Yom Shabbos, remember the Shabbos. But in the book of Devarim, when it's repeated over there, it doesn't say remember the Shabbos, it says guard the Shabbos. So which one was it? Did God say remember the Shabbos, or did God say guard the Shabbos? So the Gemara answers that the idea is Shamar v'Zachar b'dibur echad nemer. And we say this in the Friday night davening, that God said there were both. It was both, and Shamar Zachar means two different things. Again, the way it is in Shavuos, it says remember the Shabbos. The way it is in the Devarim, it says guard the Shabbos. Which is it? Zachar es Yom Shabbos. Remember, the Shabbos are all the positive obligations of Shabbos. All the things we do on Shabbos are fulfillment of Zachar es Yom Shabbos. So we daven on Shabbos, the unique parts of the davening, the Kiddush, the Havdalah, the Challah, all the proactive things we do on Shabbos fit into Zachar, into the remembering of the Shabbos. We honor the Shabbos with all, that's the proactive things we do. All the prohibitions of Shabbos fall into the category of Shamar. What did God say? Did God say guard the Shabbos or remember the Shabbos? So the Gemara answers, God said both, and it was two words that were said simultaneously. Two words that were said together. Shamar v'Zachar b'dibur echad. That's what we say in the davening. Shamar v'Zachar b'dibur echad. That God said Shamar and Zachar together. And the Talmud says this is something a human being can't do. We often hear the term, two people speaking out of both sides of their mouth, right? But in reality, you cannot say two words at once. A human being can't do that. And also it's impossible. And yes, you can't say two words at once. Can you hear two words at once? I don't know. You can't say two words at once. But God, when God gave the 10 commandments, the fourth commandment, both words were said simultaneously. Shamar and Zachar were said together. And that's why one of the ways we commemorate that, we commemorate it in the davening. But another classic way we commemorate Shamar and Zachar is with the two Shabbos candles. The tradition is we don't light one Shabbos candle, we light two Shabbos candles. Even though according to Torah law, you fulfill the obligation with one Shabbos candle. But tradition is we light two candles. Why? One keneged Shamar, one keneged Zachar. One commemorates Shamar because there's two essential ideas of Shabbos. There's two essential pillars of Shabbos, and they are Shamar and Zachar. Now the question is, why didn't God just say them both? Why does God have to say it in one word? Yeah, just say Shamar v'Zachar, it's Yom HaShabbos. So there's different. What's that? Oh, so you're saying, so Netanel is saying that because then it would force one to be before the other, and we don't want to give one any precedence to the other. Okay, that's true. That's one idea. Another idea is that it's almost as if they're intertwined. You can't have one without the other. You can't really honor the Shabbos if you're not guarding the Shabbos. That's why it was said in one word. You can't guard the Shabbos if you're not honoring the Shabbos. And I think sometimes we may get caught up in one or the other. Somebody may be so super careful on not to violate anything on Shabbos. When they think of Shabbos, they think, I'm not going to carry anything and I'm not going to cook, and I'll make sure to stay away from any possible wrongdoing on Shabbos. I will keep Shabbos to perfection. How so? By not doing anything wrong. That's nice, but you've only done half. And you cannot, Shabbos is not simply a day of don'ts. You cannot truly celebrate Shabbos unless simultaneously you're also celebrating the beauty of Shabbos, connecting to the holy energy of Shabbos, proactively connecting. It's not just a day of what you can't do. It's, as a young lady once spoke over here at the podium, and she shared an idea about Shabbos. She said, Shabbos is not a day which we are off. You know, Shabbos is my day off. Shabbos is your day that you're on. Shabbos is the day the neshama is on. It's a day on. Often we think of all the things you can't do, so I'm a day off because I can't work and I can't watch television, I can't use my cell phone, I can't drive my car, so it's a day. No, Shabbos is not a day that you can't do things. Shabbos is a day that you have to do things. You have to tap into something greater. The only way to do so is by separating yourself from the world. So you have to have the don'ts in order to get to the do. But ultimately, Shabbos is about a tremendous light that you're supposed to tap into. So that's why Shamar and Zachar are recited together to emphasize that Shabbos, you can't have one without the other. On the other hand, someone may say, all right, well, I like the energy of Shabbos. I like the davening. I like the Kiddush food. I like the chalent. I like the Kiddush, the challah. I like all the things that I'm supposed to do. But I'm not really into the prohibitions. Don't tell me not to do this. You know, my Shabbos is my way of connecting to holy energy, and I don't want to be distracted by prohibitions. So that's where the other message of Shabbos comes in. No, you can't you cannot tap into the powerful energy of Shabbos unless you turn off the world. You have to turn off the other areas of your life in order to tap in the energy of Shabbos. So Shamar v'Zachar being together is the Torah's way of saying you can't have one without the other. That's more of a like a Hasidic idea, a mystical idea. On a practical level, though, back to our question, we asked, why is it that women are obligated in the obligations of Shabbos? After all, it's a time-bound positive commandment. So the Gemara says, because Shamar and Zachar are so linked, so therefore the positive commandments and the negative commandments of Shabbos are inherently one. And therefore, the Gemara says, Kol sheyeshno b'shmira, anyone who is obligated in the prohibitions of Shabbos, and that includes women who are obligated in all prohibitions, yeshno b'zchira, are obligated in the commemorations of Shabbos and the positive commandments of Shabbos. In other words, when it comes to Shabbos, the positive and the negative are inherently intertwined because Shamar and Zachar were said together. And therefore, when it comes to Shabbos, we cannot distinguish and say women are only obligated in their prohibitions and not the obligations. Because that prohibitions and obligations of Shabbos were said together. The very words were literally said at the same time. So therefore, whoever has the prohibitions of Shabbos also has the obligations of Shabbos. And that's why women are obligated in the obligations of Shabbos, even though min haTorah. They are biblically obligated in the obligations of Shabbos, even though it goes against the general rule, which is that women are not obligated in time-bound positive commandments. All right, that's that. I'm going to jump a little here. We'll jump around a few pieces, because honestly, from here till most of the rest of the chapter of chapter 3 of Brachos talks about, I think it's something very, very, very interesting, but not necessarily what we have to get to. We'll get to that in a minute, just a minute. I want to get to the okay. I'm going to jump a little bit towards the bottom of 20b. And here's an interesting Gemara. The Gemara here is talking about benching. And the Gemara says, talking about who should lead the benching and how to lead the benching. And the Gemara points out that there are sometimes you have to bench midorai. So sometimes there's a Torah obligation to bench. When is there a Torah obligation to bench? Only when you've eaten a meal that you are satiated by. How do we know that? Because the pasuk says clearly. The pasuk, which is in the second paragraph of the Shema, says, "Ve'achalta v'savata ubeirachta." You will eat, and you will be satiated, and you will bench. You will bless God. So we see that the only time you're obligated to bench is only when you are satiated. So it's determined what exactly is the amount that is satiation. Kazayas, whether it's an ounce of food or a couple ounces, that is what's called being satiated. Then you have to bench. I once remember hearing a story about a person who struggled very much with their weight. They were extremely overweight. Whatever they did, the diets and the exercises, it didn't help. So I don't know if this caused them to check their tefillin or mezuzahs. Most people, if they're struggling with their weight, they go on a diet. But some people say, it's easy. I'll check my mezuzahs, make sure everything's okay. So this person checked their mezuzahs to see that everything was okay, or maybe just randomly they checked their mezuzahs. I heard this a real story, and the Sofer found a very interesting mistake in their mezuzah. And that is that when it came to this section of the Shema, which is in the mezuzah, instead of the verse saying "Ve'achalta v'savatu ubeirachta Hashem Elokecha," you will eat, you will be satiated, and you will bless God, it said "Ve'achalta ubeirachta." It said you will eat, and then you will bless God. And it skipped the word "you will be satiated." So that was the key to the problem. Everything is found in the mezuzah. What's that? Yeah, you eat and you will overeat. You'll never be happy. You'll never be satisfied. So that's the story as I heard it. Anyway, the pasuk, so therefore the Torah obligation of benching is only if you are satiated. However, midrabanan, the sages said that anytime you eat, you should make an after blessing. And if you look in the Siddur, there's a smaller after blessing in a situation where you haven't eaten a meal, and that's a rabbinic obligation. Based on this, the Gemara says the following: Darash Rav Avira, a man named Rav Avira, a great sage named the Rabbi Avira, said the following: Zimnin Amar Lamishmei Ravami. Sometime he said this concept in the name of Rabbi Ami. V'zimnin Amar Lamishmei Rabbi Asi. Sometimes he said in the name of Rabbi Asi. And he said, what was this that he said? What's interesting, if you look in the what does it mean that sometimes he said in the name of Rabbi Ami, sometimes he said in the name of Rabbi Asi? Which was it? Sometimes I said in the name of Rabbi Ami and sometimes Rabbi Asi. Who was the one who actually told him this idea? That's kind of technical. We don't even get to the idea, but what does that even mean? What's that? But it was the same thing. It was the same line. Sometimes he said, I heard this from Rabbi Ami. Sometimes he said, I heard this from Rabbi Asi. Background of the Rebbe that... So here's how one of the Tiferes Sion says like this. He says that Rabbi Avira was a student of both Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi, and he happened to hear this idea from both of them. He heard this idea from both of them. Therefore, depending on the audience, if it was an audience who were followers or students of Rabbi Ami, he said in the name of Rabbi Ami. And if it was an audience that were students or followers of Rabbi Asi, he said in the name of Rabbi Asi. All right, that's just a explanation of this preface. Anyways, what was it that he would say? He said, Amru Malachi Asharasam Ne'akadosh Baruch Hu. The angels said to God, Ribono Shalaylam, God in heaven, Kasuv b'Toirascha, in your Torah it is written, Asher lo yisa ponim v'lo yikach shocha. In your Torah, in the book of Devarim, chapter 10, verse number 17, it speaks about God and says, God, you do not accept bribes. It talks about how one of the great prohibitions within Torah law is the prohibition against taking a bribe. It's actually mentioned several times in the Torah because it's something which has always been a very common part of the justice system, is the concern of bribery. So the Torah speaks about the prohibition of bribery many times. But it also says that God doesn't take bribes. But the angel said that's not true. They turn to God. He says, "V'halo atanosa panim liYisrael." The word is "lo yisa panim." Sorry, but with that, it's not really about the bribes. It's the first part of the pasuk, similar to bribery, which is "lo yisa panim." You do not show favoritism. There's a prohibition against showing any sort of favoritism in judgment. Favoritism is not necessarily the obvious favoritism. Favoritism could also be extra compassion. It says a judge shouldn't show favoritism to the stronger side, maybe the more influential, wealthier, or more well-connected side, but also it's equally prohibited to show any sort of compassion to the lesser side. And a judge has to show justice is blind, as they say. You cannot see not the wealth or the influence of the greater, nor can you see the poverty or the sad state of the lesser. Justice has to be blind. But the angel said, the Torah says, Lo yisapanim, you don't show favoritism, but you do show favoritism to the Jewish people. Where do we see this idea that God shows favoritism to the Jewish people? So it's in the Birchas Kohanim, in the blessing that we say, the blessings that the priests say. The Kohen gets up on, well, it depends. If you're in an Ashkenaz shul, they get up during the holidays. In Sephardi shuls, it's either every day or every Shabbos. And what is the pasuk that we say? Yivarechecha Hashem v'yishmerecha. May God bless you and guard you. And what are the next words? Yisa Hashem panav elecha. Yisa Hashem panav elecha. How do we translate those words? I'm curious to know how the Siddur translates it. Yisa Hashem panav elecha. What's that? The Lord make his countenance shine upon you and be gracious to you. What does that mean, make his countenance shine upon you? It's actually the exact same words of Yisa Panim. It means, may God show favoritism to you. That's exactly what we're blessing one another. When the Kohen gets up and says, may God bless you, and then he says, and may God show favoritism to you. It's the exact same words. Yisa Hashem panav, which are the exact words as what it says in Devarim, Asher lo yisa panim. God does not show favoritism, and yet we bless each other that God should show favoritism. And the angel said, and we see you show favoritism. So how do you justify this? Your Torah says you don't, and yet you do. Amar lahem. What does God respond to the angels? What's that? So you're saying in compassion there's room for favoritism, and in justice there isn't.
Maybe I'm saying the name of God that was used. What was the name of God that was
in Devarim, Yud Zayin? I don't have a Devarim in front of me. But it's the typical name is Hashem. Is it a different name? That's an interesting thought. But it's hard to, how does that really answer the question though? You know, regardless of the name, so what if a judge goes by a different name? Then he could accept a bribe. Aha. I think you're onto something. It's a nice idea that perhaps, and God is as a justice, we say justice, there's no room for favoritism. But as God conducts to us as a parent, so it's okay for a parent to show favoritism to a child, right? 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 Maybe this is, all right, that's an interesting answer. Interesting answer. Gemara says something a little bit different. So, but here's what the Gemara says. The Gemara says, Amar lahem HaKadosh Baruch Hu. God says, although maybe it works, maybe it still works with this idea. Amar lahem, to which God responded to the Jewish people, V'chilo es apanim liYisrael. How can I not show them favoritism? Why? It's very interesting. He says, because they've shown such a degree of commitment to me. Where do they show commitment? It's very simple. You know, you'd think if God wants to tell the angels, I love them because of their commitment, where do you think God would turn to? Which example would God use to show that the Jewish people show such a degree of commitment? Maybe it would be Shabbos or self-sacrifice or other ideas. No. Where is the commitment? In the blessing we make after we eat. How can I not show favoritism to them? In the Torah, all I asked them was, you should eat, and if you're satiated, you should thank me. God says in the Torah, all I said is that if you have a full meal and you're satiated, then you should thank me. And they have taken this to the next level, and they make a blessing of thanks, even if they only had a much smaller amount, the amount of a kazayis. So kabetza would be, I guess, the amount of to be satiated. And because they've shown such commitment to me, that they don't only thank me after a full meal, but even after a partial meal, they thank me then too. How can I not show favoritism to such people? Very interesting. So this is, of all the things God wants to turn to explain to the angels why he's kind of, I have no choice. I have to show favoritism to them. What is it? It's the fact that we thank God even after a small meal, and not just as God requested of us, which is to thank God after a big meal. All right, so that's that Gemara. I have to get to the Gemara, which I said we'll talk about.
Evidence, the word, all the hope that we get, it means like all over the place.
Seems to be more evidence of favoritism.
Right.
I think the reasoning.
Over the other nation.
I think right. I think the reasoning is because literally it's the same exact words. It's the very words that God says, "Lo yisa panim." Those words we use when we bless one another. We say, "Yisa Hashem panav." So maybe that's why it gives that example. You're right. There does seem to be a theme throughout Torah, but perhaps it's although to be fair, if you look in Torah, there are many blessings mentioned in Torah. God will bless the Jewish people, but then there's warnings and there's pretty harsh punishments which are mentioned specifically to the Jewish people, which aren't mentioned in the nations. It's almost as if God says, you're the chosen people, you're chosen for blessing, but I'm also going to be watching you very carefully. The pasuk says that very clearly in the end of Devarim. The pasuk over there, I think it's Nitzavim. Ki kasher yiyaser ishes beno Hashem Elokim meyasreka. As a parent will rebuke or even punish severely their child, God punishes you. In other words, your connection to God leads to reward, but also to perhaps more severe punishment. So it kind of works both ways. But I think more specifically, it's just because of exactly the wording. The wording is exactly what God says I won't do. Lo yisa panim, and we say yisa Hashem panav. So I think that's why that is focused on to ask this question. All right, to get to the next to the point we wanted to get to about minyan. So I promised that I didn't promise. I texted. I don't think a text is a promise, but I did text that we'll get to the question of what is the source of a minyan. So it's 21b. And over here, the Gemara is talking about the following, to give the context, because we only have a few minutes. To give the context of this next statement. The Gemara says like this. If you walk into shul late, God forbid that should ever happen, but theoretically, if you walk into shul late and the congregation is in the middle of the Amidah. Amidah is the highlight of the prayers, the essence of prayer. You know, you're concerned that if you start prayer now, the repetition of the Amidah will begin while you're praying. So the question is, should I wait till I hear the repetition of the Amidah and then do my own prayer? Or should I just begin on my own? And the Talmud says, two opinions. The second opinion is, if, and it's based on you have to calculate. If you calculate that you will conclude your private Shemona Esrei in time to respond to Kedusha, when the Chazan reaches the Kedusha, Nakdishach v'Naritzach, then you can begin on your own. But if you surmise that you're so late that if you start now, when the Chazan starts the repetition and gets to the Kedusha, you're still going to be in the middle of your Shemona Esrei, then you should not start the Shemona Esrei. In other words, make sure that you will be able to respond the Kedusha with the minyan. And the Gemara says, why? What's the significance of this? Because Kedusha, the prayer of Kedusha, Nakdishach, is something that can only be done with a minyan. There are certain holier parts of the davening which an individual who prays cannot say on their own. Only if you're davening with a minyan can you say that. This leads the Gemara to the question of, where does that come from? Where does this come from that when you're with a minyan, suddenly you can say certain holier parts of the davening that you can't do without a minyan? For example, the Kedusha. For example, the Kaddish. For example, the Torah reading. All of these are only done when there is a minyan. What's the source of it? And what's the logic to it? I'm not sure if we're going to get to the logic so much today, but what is the source of the idea that certain parts of the davening can only be done with a minyan? After all, if I'm praying to God, so then why does it matter if there's another 9 people praying alongside? Why does that matter? All that matters is that I'm praying. And why 9? Why not 7? You know, there's other numbers which are significant. 3, 7, 12. So where does the number 10 come from? So here's what the Gemara says. Brachos 21b, towards the top of the page. Amar Rav Ada bar Ahava, Rav Ada, the son of Ahava, stated, Minayin she'ein hayachid omer kedusha. How do I know that an individual is not allowed to recite the kedusha on their own? Shenemar, because the pasuk says, pasuk in Vayikra, chapter 22, verse number 32. Torah portion of Kedoshim. The pasuk says, "V'nikdashti b'toch b'nei Yisrael," which means I will be sanctified among the Jewish people. That's the words. I will be sanctified among the Jewish people. I am sanctified. I think I will be sanctified. God says, I will be sanctified. Who sanctifies God? Us. God says, I want you to sanctify me. But the wording is specific. V'nikdashti betoch b'nei Yisrael, among the Jewish people. Betoch perhaps would be in the midst of. The word in the midst of is very specifically a group. You wouldn't say in the midst of one person. In the midst of the Jewish people implies that there has to be a group. So this is step number 1. Step number 1 is that God says, in order to truly sanctify me, it has to be in the midst of Jewish people. So we already come to see that there is added that the true sanctification of God is when there's a group of people. Okay? Well, that doesn't help us. Is that, what does that have to do with a minyan? Maybe the midst could be 3 or 4 or 5. So that's where the next step in this process comes, and that is Kol davar shebekdusha, anything of added holiness. Lo yehe pachos me'asara, should not be with less than 10 people. But how do we know 10? How do we know 10? So the Gemara says, here's where we use another Torah tool. Again, this is a unique Torah tool, and that is the Tani, Rabbi Noi, Achvad Rav Chia, Rav Noi, the brother of Chia, the son of Rav Abba, said that we derive the word toich. The word over here again is toich. Toich means amidst. One of the ways to derive laws in Torah is called the concept of Gzeira Shava. Gzeira Shava is that if the same word, a unique word, is used in one area of Torah, and that same word is used in another area of Torah, we can apply the ideas or an idea from one to the other. If the same word is used and we need help understanding one area, perhaps we can draw inference and lesson from the other area. That's called a Gzeira Shava. A rule of, I don't know how to translate Gzeira Shava in English, the rule of equal. The equal word is mentioned in each of the, in 2 places in the Torah, so therefore you can apply the concepts from one to the other. Over here, the Torah says, "V'niktashti betoch b'nei Yisrael." I will be sanctified among the Jewish people. Toch. There's another place in Torah where it uses the word toch in the context of a group, and that has to do with the spies. When the spies went to Canaan, Israel, and came back with a negative report, God says to Moshe, after they came back from a negative report, and God was very upset at them, upset at the Jewish people for listening to them. But one of the things God says, one of the words that God says, this is in Bamidbar, in the book of Bamidbar, chapter 15, verse 21. God says, "Hibadlu mitoch ha'eda hazos." Separate yourself from among this congregation. God was telling Moshe, separate yourself from this evil congregation. Who was the evil congregation? The spies. How many spies were sent? 12. But how many of the 12 were evil? 10. So 10, because 2 were righteous. So when God says to Moshe, separate yourself, mitoch ha'eda, from among this group, how many people is that group? 10. So we apply the rule of that toch, which is specifically referring to 10, as we know, to the other toch, which is v'niktashti betoch b'nei Yisrael, sanctify yourself among the Jewish people. From here we can derive that the concept of making God, sanctifying God in a group is 10, because the other place it said toch was specifically referring to 10 people. We applied that rule because of the concept of Gzeira Shava to this toch, Gzeira Shava, and that's how we come to understand the idea of the holiness of a minyan. This is the source of the concept of a minyan, such a very fundamental idea in Judaism is a minyan. The concept of a minyan is derived from the 10 wicked spies. That's where we come to. That is one of the sources of the unique element of a group of 10 being able to sanctify God properly, is this process of understanding. All right, we'll stop here. And God willing, continue. We may jump to chapter 4 of Brachos next week, jump 5 or 6 pages.
Zaku Baruch.
Zaku Baruch.
Thank you. Good Shabbos.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.